Bloods versus Crips, the rivalry that shaped Little Rock. In the early 1990s, Little Rock, Arkansas became the unlikeliest of battlegrounds. Far from the sprawling streets of Los Angeles, two of America's most notorious gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, brought their war to the heart of the South. This is the story of how that rivalry took root and how it left scars still visible today. It began with migration. In the late 1980s, families moved from California to Little Rock, bringing with them the culture, style, and conflicts of their home neighborhoods. Some of these newcomers were affiliated with gangs. They brought more than just memories. They brought a code, a way of life, and a war. By the early 90s, Little Rock's east and south sides were divided into territories. The Bloods, dominant in numbers, spread through sets like the Highland Park Pirates, Vice Lords, and East End Piru. Their rivals, the Crips, concentrated in smaller but deeply entrenched strongholds, most famously the Wolf Street Crips. The Bloods and Crips rivalry in Little Rock wasn't just a carbon copy of Los Angeles. It adapted to the city's streets. Some members had genuine California roots, while others were local recruits drawn in by the allure of protection, identity, and fast money. Drugs, especially crack cocaine, became the fuel for this fire. The city's small size made competition fierce. Every corner mattered. Every block meant profit or loss. 1993 marked the breaking point. That year, Little Rock recorded between 70 and 76 homicides, a record high. Almost all were tied to gang conflicts, and many traced back to the Bloods versus Crips feud. Shootouts became common. Retaliations were swift. A killing in one neighborhood could trigger a chain of reprisals across the city. The Wolf Street Crips became notorious for holding their ground inside what was essentially a sea of blood-controlled territory. Their three-block island in central Little Rock stood as both a point of pride and a flashpoint for violence. The Bloods, larger in number, repeatedly tested those borders. The Crips answered every challenge. The national spotlight arrived in 1994 when HBO aired Gang War, Bangin' in Little Rock. The documentary shocked viewers with images of teenagers armed with assault rifles, boasting about murders, and openly claiming gang affiliation. For much of America, it was the first time they saw Little Rock not as a quiet southern city, but as a war zone. Law enforcement responded with aggressive gang sweeps, new anti-gang units, and federal task forces. Dozens of leaders were arrested, but for every gang member taken off the streets, new recruits stepped forward. The culture was self-sustaining, fed by poverty, fractured families, and the lure of quick money. For the community, the cost was devastating. Families were torn apart. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. Schools became recruiting grounds. In some neighborhoods, fear of retaliation kept witnesses silent, allowing the cycle to continue. They told us it was about colors, one former member recalls. But really, it was about survival. You couldn't walk certain streets. You couldn't wear certain clothes. You had to choose a side. By the late 1990s, the murder rate began to fall. Federal crackdowns, community intervention programs, and a shift in the drug market weakened the gang's grip. But the rivalry never disappeared entirely. Even today, Blood and Crip sets remain active in Little Rock, smaller, more fragmented, but still dangerous. The Bloods and Crips rivalry in Little Rock wasn't just a local problem, it was a warning. It showed that gang culture could take root anywhere, adapting to any city's streets. For Little Rock, it was a war imported from thousands of miles away, but fought in its own backyards. And though the 1990s are long gone, the echoes of that war still linger, carried on in stories, scars, and memories that the city will never forget. The rise of major street gangs in Little Rock, late 1980s to 1990s. In the late 1980s, Little Rock, Arkansas, was a city caught in transition. Its downtown struggling, its neighborhoods under economic strain, and its youth searching for identity in a rapidly changing world. It was here, far from Los Angeles or Chicago, that a violent storm began to brew. What started as loose neighborhood crews evolved into fully formed street gangs. By the early 1990s, Little Rock was no longer immune to the gang epidemic sweeping America. The Bloods and Crips, born in the streets of Los Angeles, began planting roots in the city. But these were not distant copycats. They were the real thing. Members who had family ties in California brought the colors, codes, and deadly rivalries with them. On the Blood side, factions like the Highland Park Pirates, once the Highland Court Crew, emerged from the Highland Park housing projects. Initially, disputes with rivals like Vice Dice, 8-Ball Gangsters, and Granite Mountain were more about local pride than bloodshed. But as crack cocaine hit the streets, the stakes changed. Dance battles turned into shootouts. Fists were replaced by firearms. 1993 became the year that shocked America. Little Rock recorded between 70 and 76 homicides, an all-time high, making it one of the most dangerous cities per capita in the nation. Nearly every killing was linked in some way to the gang wars. On the other side of the conflict were the Crips, with notorious sets like the Wolf Street Crips. Their territory was small, just a few blocks, but it was fiercely defended, even though it sat in the heart of blood-dominated neighborhoods. For more than 30 years, they maintained their presence, their name whispered with both fear and respect. The violence caught the attention of the national media. In 1994, HBO aired a documentary that showed the rest of America what Little Rock had been living with. Children as young as 12 carrying guns, families burying teenagers, and neighborhoods patrolled by armed lookouts. But this wasn't just about colors or territory. Drugs were the real currency of power. Crack cocaine flooded the city, bringing with it money, greed, and a cycle of addiction that tore apart communities. Gangs became organized crime groups, running distribution networks, enforcing control through fear, and punishing anyone who crossed them. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. The Little Rock Police Department, unprepared for the scale of the problem, ramped up anti-gang units. Federal agents were called in. Major sweeps led to dozens of arrests, but every time a gang leader was taken down, someone younger and more ruthless stepped up to fill the void. Yet, even in the height of the bloodshed, there were those trying to pull youth away from the life. Church groups, neighborhood mentors, and former gang members began intervention programs. Some succeeded, many didn't. By the late 1990s, the murder rate began to decline. Tougher policing, community outreach, and shifting drug markets reduced the scale of open warfare. But the scars remained, families broken, friends lost, and neighborhoods forever changed. The rise of major street gangs in Little Rock during the late 1980s and 1990s was not just a local story. It was a reflection of America's urban crisis, where poverty, drugs, and identity collided in a way that gave violence a home. It showed that no city, no matter its size, was too far removed to escape the reach of gang culture. Today, the city continues to battle gang influence, but the lessons of that violent era still echo in its streets. The 1990s may have ended, but for many in Little Rock, the war never truly stopped. The Untouchables, Little Rock's forgotten street gang. Before the colors of red and blue, before the names of Bloods and Crips echoed through the streets, there was another gang in Little Rock, a homegrown faction with a name that carried both swagger and menace. They called themselves the Untouchables. Born in the early 1960s, the Untouchables were unlike the modern street gangs that would later dominate the city. They weren't born out of national affiliation, but out of a shared identity. Young men from working-class neighborhoods bonded by style, bravado, and a desire to be feared. Their name came from pop culture, inspired by the television series The Untouchables, which dramatized Prohibition-era lawmen fighting organized crime. This Little Rock crew adopted the title ironically. They weren't the law, they were the outlaws. They dressed sharp, long trench coats, brimmed hats, and polished shoes. It was their uniform, a visual signature that set them apart from other youth cliques. They didn't need bright colors or hand signs. Their look was their reputation, and with it came intimidation. The Untouchables weren't about drug empires or national turf wars. Instead, their activities revolved around neighborhood dominance, control of school dances, public hangouts, and occasionally the streets themselves. They carried weapons, sometimes sawed-off shotguns or switchblades, not necessarily to use, but to ensure everyone knew they could. Their territory was fluid, but their presence was most often felt at local sporting events, especially high school football games at Little Rock Central and Hall High. They became infamous for showing up en masse, their trench coats swaying as they walked, sending a ripple of unease through the crowd. Police knew their names, but in an era before modern anti-gang laws, enforcement was limited. Many times, the Untouchables were more about image and intimidation than about sustained violence. But make no mistake, when fights broke out, they fought hard. Their clashes were often with rival neighborhood crews, groups without the same polish or notoriety, but eager to challenge their dominance. The Untouchables defended their name fiercely. To lose a fight meant losing status, and status was everything. As the decade moved on, the world around them changed. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and cultural shifts in music and fashion began reshaping Little Rock's youth culture. New styles replaced trench coats. New forms of rebellion emerged. By the early 1970s, the Untouchables had faded. Some members grew up, found jobs, and left the life behind. Others fell into the rising tide of drug-related crime that would sweep through the city in the decades to come. But their influence lingered. They weren't like the gangs you see now. They didn't have machine guns or drug money. But when the Untouchables walked into a place, everybody noticed. You either respected them, or you got out of the way. In the history of Little Rock gangs, the Untouchables stand out as a unique transitional chapter, bridging the gap between the local street cliques of the 1950s and the nationally connected gangs that would arrive in the late 1980s. They were a product of their time, part fashion statement, part intimidation crew, and part community legend. The Untouchables are gone now. No murals, no documentaries, no headlines remember them like the gangs that came after. But for a generation of Little Rock residents, their image, trench coats, cold stares, and a fearless stride, remains etched in memory. A reminder that in every city's history, there are shadows between the headlines, and stories that fade before they are ever told. Modern gang conflicts. Real Hustlers, Inc. versus Wolf Street Crips. For decades, Little Rock, Arkansas, has lived in the shadow of its gang wars. The names and faces have changed, but the violence remains. In the modern era, one rivalry has defined the city streets: the ongoing conflict between Real Hustlers Incorporated, known as RHI, and the Wolf Street Crips. Real Hustlers, Inc. emerged from the Monroe Street Hustlers, a blood-affiliated crew with deep ties to the city's east side. They built their name on drug sales, armed robberies, and a reputation for intimidation. For RHI, the streets were business, and business meant protecting territory at all costs. Their rivals, the Wolf Street Crips, were no newcomers. This Crip set had held its ground since the early 1990s, maintaining control over a 3-block stretch in the middle of a blood-heavy area. They were outnumbered, but never outgunned, earning a reputation for resilience and defiance. By the mid-2000s teens, tensions between RHI and the Wolf Street Crips had reached a boiling point. Both sides were fighting for control of drug distribution networks, not just in Little Rock, but in surrounding counties. Every arrest, every shooting, every territorial push brought retaliation. Then came the night of July 1st, 2017. Inside the Power Ultra Lounge, a downtown nightclub, a fight broke out during a performance by a Memphis rapper. Witnesses say it started as an argument between affiliates of RHI and members of the Wolf Street Crips. Within seconds, it turned into chaos. Multiple shooters opened fire into the packed crowd. 25 people were injured. Miraculously, no one died, but the incident shook the city. It was the worst mass shooting in Little Rock's history, and it forced the public to confront the reality. The city's gang wars hadn't disappeared. They'd evolved. In the months that followed, the violence escalated. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, and targeted attacks became a grim routine. Little Rock police linked at least a dozen shootings to the RHI Wolf Street Crips feud. The battles weren't just over street corners, they were about power, revenge, and reputation. In February 2018, local, state, and federal authorities launched a sweeping crackdown. A massive operation involving the DEA, FBI, and ATF led to the arrest of 49 individuals connected to the two gangs. Agents seized firearms, large amounts of meth and crack cocaine, and thousands of dollars in cash. U.S. Attorney Cody Highland called the operation a pioneering effort to dismantle violent gangs in the Little Rock area. For a moment, it seemed like the city might get a reprieve. But the truth was more complicated. Leaders were locked up, but lieutenants stepped in to keep operations running. The drug trade continued. The hatred between RHI and the Wolf Street Crips didn't fade with the arrests. It simply went quieter. By 2020, gang-related shootings were again on the rise. Investigators say both sides adapted, becoming more careful with their moves, but just as dangerous. Social media became a new battleground. Taunts, threats, and coded messages fueling the cycle of violence. For residents living in affected neighborhoods, the fear is constant. Parents keep children indoors after dark. Street corners that once bustled with life now feel like danger zones. We've got kids growing up thinking these guys are role models. They see the cars, the money, the respect, but they don't see the funerals, the prison cells, the broken families. The RHI Wolf Street Crips rivalry is the modern face of Little Rock's gang problem. It's smaller in scale than the blood-soaked 1990s, but no less deadly. The weapons are more advanced, the tactics more calculated, and the stakes just as high. Little Rock's gang wars have never truly ended. They've simply changed uniforms, changed names, and changed rules. And as long as power, profit, and pride remain at the heart of the streets, the cycle between crews like RHI and the Wolf Street Crips will continue, each side waiting for the next spark to light another fire.